Tonight at 10, for the first time, ministers acknowledged that Britain could still be paying into the European Union after Brexit. David Davis, the Brexit secretary, said today that carrying on paying money to the EU could be an option.
The major criterion here is that we get the best possible access for goods and services to the European market.
Every week, we send £350 million to Brussels.
But some of those who campaigned to leave the EU in the referendum campaign are less than impressed.
People would be absolutely outraged if we came out of the EU and then carried on paying them 15 billion a year, 10 billion a year, or whatever the figure is.
And we'll be asking how Brussels is likely to respond to the latest signal from the UK government. Also tonight, official estimates suggest immigration to the UK reached its highest ever level in the year running up to the EU referendum. We talked to another former footballer who says he was sexually abused. He says it happened in the youth team at Manchester City. 3 weeks after his presidential victory, Donald Trump embarks on his thank you tour of the USA. And from Hampshire to the Hebrides, a new teacher at last for a tiny island community off the west coast of Scotland.
And here in the south, more abuse claims as former players at Southampton Football Club allege they were sexually assaulted by a former member of staff. And a jury hears how medics tried to save the life of a 19-day-old baby.
Good evening. For the first time, ministers have acknowledged that Britain could still be making payments to the European Union after leaving in order to secure favourable access to European markets. The Brexit secretary, David Davis, said that this was an option if it meant getting the best deal. But some Conservative MPs said that people who voted leave would be outraged at that idea. Our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, reports now, and there is some flash photography coming up.
Every week, we send £350 million to Brussels.
What did the country vote for? More power for our government, but for many, the promise of cash that's spent by the EU being spent by us. But for the first time, a senior minister has confirmed, even after we've left the Union, we might still pay in.
Will the government consider making any contribution in any shape or form for access to the single market?
The major criterion here is that we get the best possible access for goods and services to the European market. And if that is included in what he's talking about, then of course we would consider it.
Remember, ministers aren't meant to be giving anything away. But he's not the only one staring into the vacuum. He was backed by the Chancellor this afternoon. Our membership right now costs £11 billion a year. But after Brexit, we might pay for the single market to trade freely around the continent, or to remain part of research and science projects, for example. And there'll be exit costs too, like the pensions of EU staff. Brexit! But that wasn't quite what many voters bargained for. And some MPs who campaigned to leave would fight it tooth and claw.
People would be absolutely outraged if we came out of the EU and then carried on paying them 15 billion a year, 10 billion a year, or whatever the figure is. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
But should we keep paying something to the EU if it means we'd prosper? Labour isn't yet sure.
We were promised no running commentary, so we've got that. That's the first broken promise. The idea of paying for access, I'm not really sure what that means.
And tonight, another hint from Mr Davis, speaking at a business event in Wales. Labour shortages won't be in anyone's interests, he said. A clue that low-skilled European migrants may still be allowed to come here after Brexit if business needs them.
Theresa May's tight-lipped negotiating logic has been simple. In a game of high-stakes poker, it doesn't make sense to show your hand. But little by little, deliberately or not, ministers are starting to display a few of the cards.
Yeah, too quick.
The government never gave up on photo opportunities, but had intended to keep quiet on its plans for Brexit. But piece by piece we're learning it's their positions, not the referendum promises, that will hold sway. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's get some thoughts from Brussels then. Let's talk to our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticas. And Damien, the question is, What is the view there about buying access without any strings attached?
Well, Hugh, I mean, if we think that the UK is one of the biggest contributors to the EU budget, and when those contributions stop, you might imagine the UK would think that would give it some leverage, offering to continue. There are countries that pay into the EU budget, diverse countries like Israel, pay for access to things like student exchange programs, science, common science research. But more important, of course, is the access to the single market. And there, the closest you might think is Norway. It pays into the EU budget, it participates in the single market, but crucially, it also then has to accept EU rules in many areas, and importantly there, the freedom of movement of people. Now, if we listen to what EU leaders have said since the referendum, they've been very clear. They have said the UK cannot pick and choose, they will not change the rules. They haven't indicated at all that money would make them change their minds. Hugh.
Damien, thanks very much again. Damien Grammaticus there in Brussels. Well, one of the main debating points, of course, in the referendum campaign was immigration. And the latest official figures suggest that immigration to the UK has risen to its highest ever level. According to estimates from the Office for National Statistics, there were 650,000 immigrants in the 12 months to the end of June. Net migration, that is the difference between that number and those who leave, well, that remains at well over 300,000, and that is well above the government's target of below 100,000. Our home editor Mark Easton has this report.
It's Romania's National Day, and in what's called Little Romania, Burnt Oak in northwest London, the bakery is preparing for a celebration. But with record numbers of Romanians arriving in the UK, there's still concern about what's going to happen to the 3.5 million EU nationals already living in Britain. Immediately after the referendum, Mihaela told her family they needed to become British.
I say, let's try to apply for residency, then next year we apply for passport.
So citizenship?
Mm-hmm.
You want to become British?
Yeah, I hope so. I feel a bit disappointed because of the Brexit, but what can I do, no?
Will you stay or go?
I'm going to stay. Yeah, I'm going to stay.
With the Labour Party saying EU residents are being used as bargaining chips, bakery owner Ovidia says many Romanians are nervous about their future.
People are scared, you know, they are simple people which they are scared, and obvious they jump to apply immediately, you know what I mean, even if it's going to be a process to apply. It's not so easy to apply overnight.
Figures released today show that in the 3 months after the Brexit vote, the Home Office received 1,000 applications every day from EU citizens wanting to become British residents, almost 3 times the normal level and expected to rise further. Meanwhile, the number of EU workers applying for national insurance numbers is down 4% overall, 17% down for Poles and Lithuanians, suggesting the referendum may be beginning to slow numbers arriving. Now, before the vote, it was business as usual, with net migration still at well over 3 times the government target, a commitment ministers say Brexit will help deliver.
Well, Brexit gives us the opportunity to control numbers coming in from the rest of Europe in the same way that we can control numbers coming in from outside Europe. So I think there's an opportunity during the negotiations to ensure we can deliver on that, which I think was central to the referendum campaign and a clear message from the British people.
The Prime Minister has restated her personal determination to get net migration below 100,000. When Home Secretary, it's emerged, she wanted the children of illegal immigrants to be denied school places. But today's figures show non-EU immigration is still higher than that from Europe. A reminder that controlling borders doesn't necessarily mean closing the door. Mark Easton, BBC News, Burnt Oak.
The poor performance of some schools in the north of England and the Midlands is damaging the life chances of students and creating resentment among parents. That was the message from the Chief Inspector of Schools, Sir Michael Wilshaw, today in his last speech in the Post. And he also said that failing schools contributed, in his view, to the frustration expressed by many during the Brexit vote. Our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, has more details.
Mia's training to be a gas engineer in Manchester. She prefers hands-on learning to studying. At school, Mia got some GCSEs. She passed maths but had to resit English after she left.
It's not got me where I wanted to be. It was a bit boring and bit time consuming, to be honest. So you don't really want to be in school, do you?
It's a mixture of...
Today, a warning that young people in the north deserve better from their schools.
It's feeding into a sense that the people of Manchester and Liverpool and the north of England are not being treated fairly, that their children have less of a chance of educational success than people south of the Wash. And that's feeding into a wider malaise that I sense with the Brexit vote. That actually, it wasn't just about leaving Europe, it was about our needs are being neglected.
How important in that is the difficulty that schools in some parts of the north of England have in recruiting teachers?
Part of my job is to talk to head teachers every week, and I do here and elsewhere, and all of them are saying they've never seen it as bad as it is at the moment.
This is about the number of good or outstanding secondary schools. In London, that's 90% of schools. In Manchester, 70%. And in Liverpool, just 50%. Across all of England, there's been an improvement of 13% since 2011, according to Ofsted. But in the northwest, just 3% improvement. This school in a deprived part of Manchester offers its pupils an outstanding education, and that really alters their life chances. But that's not true of many of the secondary schools nearby.
If a child goes there, they will score 8 Ds. If they come here, they will get 8 Bs or 8 Cs. So across 8 subjects, they get a whole grade better.
That is life-changing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's the same children from the same street who live in the same street but couldn't get into this school.
The government says it's targeting money at schools in the north. But tonight, it emerged plans for a national teaching service are being dropped. It was meant to put more than 1,000 good teachers into struggling schools.
The sense of alienation.
And that's what he says communities like Gorton in Manchester need to give children from these streets a better chance. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News, Manchester.
The United Nations has said it's considering a Russian proposal to create 4 humanitarian corridors into eastern Aleppo in Syria to allow in aid and to evacuate hundreds of sick and injured people. But Syria and Russia have rejected a request for a pause in the fighting. The city is divided, with the regime holding the western side and rebel groups holding a shrinking section to the east. And thousands of civilians have attempted to flee the intense fighting since the weekend. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in western Aleppo, and she sent this report.
No one can truly see where this brutal war is taking Aleppo now, but all too clear are the scars it's left behind. We drove into West Aleppo today. On its edges, a wrecked landscape. Skeletal buildings on streets once full of life. And in the rebel-held east of this city, a destructive conflict intensifies. The Syrian military, backed by Iranian and Russian allies, are pushing deeper into this enclave. Rebel forces have now regrouped, vowing to fight back. The worst battles of this 6-year war are creating its worst humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of people are fleeing into West Aleppo, the area under government control, taking refuge in shelters like this. But no one can escape the agony.
I am concerned about my children and country. I wish Syria would return to the way it was 5 years ago, the country of safety, of prosperity.
In Geneva today, the UN again called on all sides to protect the people of Aleppo, especially those still trapped in the east, where food and medicine are running out.
The Russian Federation announced that there are 4 humanitarian corridors that they want to sit down now in Aleppo with our people there to discuss how we can use the 4 corridors to evacuate people out.
On the streets of West Aleppo, a cold winter closes in. You can hear the thud of war. Life can look and feel strangely normal on this side, but there's shelling and hardship here too.
What happens here in Aleppo has always mattered to the Syrian conflict.
It was the last major city to be drawn into the uprising. And now as the battle for this city enters what could be a final decisive phase, there's a profound sense that it matters, not just to Aleppo, but the course of the entire war.
Every day another light goes out. Now the last clown of East Aleppo has been killed in an airstrike. 24-year-old Anas Salabasha was known as the man who made children laugh, a rare bit of joy in the darkest of times.
Let's go live to Aleppo tonight, and Lisa's there for us. Lisa, this proposal for 4 humanitarian corridors, how realistic do you think that is?
Year in, year out in this war, the cry has been, what will it take? What will work to get the warring sides to care about the population? Year in, year out, there's been a call for a negotiated end to the war. Then, for months, they were urging a 48-hour humanitarian pause. And now they are focusing on humanitarian corridors, the least worst option for the warring sides, to see if that will work. You heard Jan Egeland from the UN saying that the Russians were considering this. But this has been discussed so many times before, and there have been arguments among the warring parties. What roads will be used? Accusations that one side or another will open fire, will take advantage of the situation. And all this as another harsh winter closes in, and real alarm about the situation, particularly for civilians in the east of Aleppo, where stocks have almost run dry. The food and medicine to keep people alive, that is, if they survive the fighting.
Lisa, once again, thanks very much. Lisa Doucette there for us with the latest in Aleppo. Now, police forces say around 350 people have now come forward to say they were sexually abused as children by people involved in football. The NSPCC, which is running a telephone helpline to take calls from complainants, has revealed that some of the allegations relate to present-day abuse. Gareth Southgate, on his first day as England football manager, insisted that, in his view, children are far safer in football than they were 15 to 20 years ago. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has this report.
The appointment of a New England manager usually leads to questions about teams and tactics, but with the sport engulfed in an escalating sex abuse scandal, Gareth Southgate today knew he had to face it head-on.
I played with one of the players who's recently come forward, and the reality of that, as they have said, is that they haven't felt able to speak about that until this moment. I think the world was very different 20 years ago. I think it is important we acknowledge that and learn from it. And I repeat, I think a lot of those lessons have already been learned, because that's why the situation we have now in terms of child protection looks completely different.
The sheer scale of this scandal is remarkable. Today, the police revealed they'd received 350 complaints from people who say they've been abused. Here at Greater Manchester Police alone, they've identified 10 suspects.
Several people have told the BBC that they were abused by this man, former North West-based football coach Frank Roper, who died in 2005. Jason Dunford says he was one of Roper's victims while a youth player, and told me today how he felt having learned about his abuser's death.
He was so aggressive, he was certainly one that had to be brought to justice. I was angry at first, and now I'm looking at the positive. Now I've slept on it, I'm looking at the positives of him not being able to affect my life or anyone else's life anymore.
Dunford also says he witnessed Roper abusing a teammate.
That noise and that fear has never left my body today, and still frightens me.
Meanwhile, it's emerged that Chelsea in the last 3 years made a payment to a former youth player who claimed he was abused by the club's chief scout in the 1970s. An internal inquiry's been launched amid reports other big clubs may have made similar payments. When asked about the consequences of any club cover-ups, the FA had this to say.
We have clear laws and rules in the game that need to be followed, and if there's been any evidence of a breach of those, so hushing up would be one, subject to due process, i.e. the police need to be the right place in this. When it's our turn to apply the rules, we absolutely will.
And tonight, Southampton became the latest club implicated. Several former players, including Dean Radford, seen here when a trainee, telling the BBC how they were subject to years of grooming and abuse by a former member of staff.
He then
asked me to go back to his room, where I basically let down. And he, I mean, the club itself, I do hold partly responsible for it because of they must have known, they must have heard these rumours going around because everybody else had.
And with more players set to come forward, the appalling secret that British football appears to have harboured for so long is finally being exposed. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Let's have a brief look at some of the day's other news stories now. A new system to warn people about poor air quality in London has been triggered for the first time. The alerts about high levels of pollution are being displayed at hundreds of bus stops and tube stations and along some main roads. Police in Essex have charged a 15-year-old boy with the manslaughter of a Polish man. Arkadiusz Józwicz, who was 40, was attacked in Harlow in August. The teenager can't be named for legal reasons. The government has offered improved pay and pensions to frontline prison officers to try to end a long-running dispute in England and Wales. The new package has been endorsed by the Prison Officers Association and will now be put to members. Some 10,000 officers stopped work a fortnight ago amid concern about the rising levels of violence in prisons and staff shortages. Now, the US President-elect Donald Trump is embarking on what he calls a thank you tour of America. He's in Ohio this evening, addressing a crowd of supporters, the first of several stops in which he'll revisit the states that helped him win the White House. The BBC's Sarah Smith is in Cincinnati tonight. We can join Sarah now.
Waiting here for the president-elect, we've got some rather vocal pro- and anti-Trump supporters, and inside thousands of Trump enthusiasts waiting to hear what will be his first major speech since election night. Earlier today, he stopped off in Indiana and visited a factory which has just reversed a decision to spend 1,000 jobs to Mexico. This is a big deal for Donald Trump. After all his campaign promises, it would have been a huge blow if he had not persuaded Carrier Corporation to keep 1,000 jobs in Indiana.
Companies are not going to leave the United States anymore without consequences. Not going to happen.
In Ohio, the Butler County Vintage Car Club get together every other Thursday. Trump supporters, to a man, they care far less about his divisive rhetoric and more about his promises to return manufacturing jobs.
He's already 2 months before he's sworn in, he's going to get credit in great part for Carrier in Indiana preserving 1,000 jobs that otherwise were going to be moved to Mexico. Now that's 1,000 lives and families that their life hasn't been turned totally upside down.
Trump's shifting positions on climate change, healthcare and prosecuting Hillary Clinton don't seem to bother anyone here.
He says he doesn't want to hurt the Clintons, and I think that's good for the country.
But his supporters were all chanting, "Lock her up," during the campaign.
Yeah, that's true, but I think, campaigning and politicking one thing and running the country is another.
We found the local Trump campaign office is still open. Hi there, Joe.
Yes?
Sarah Smith from the BBC.
Hi, pleased to meet you.
Joe says he's still handing out yard signs.
Yeah, I have people coming in and asking for them still.
You see, the election's over.
I know, people want them.
Donald Trump won in states like Ohio thanks to a groundswell of working class support.
I think the Republican Party is reinventing itself right now. We're becoming the party of the working man and woman.
And it's Donald Trump that's doing that, a billionaire from New York.
Well, you know what? He's a self-made billionaire. He wasn't born a billionaire. He's a self-made billionaire. So he's providing the venue for the rest of us to do it.
Ohio is one of the states the polls said was neck and neck, yet delivered a large victory for Trump. Tonight, he will relish saying thank you. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Cincinnati, Ohio.
Now, the President of France, François Hollande, has announced that he is not standing for re-election next year. The President, who was elected as a socialist in 2012, made the announcement in a televised address to the nation this evening. His exceptionally weak ratings in the polls meant that he would have faced a very tough battle to make it to the final round of voting next year. For more on this, let's talk to our correspondent, Lucy Williamson in Paris. How much of a surprise was it, Lucy, and how will it affect the campaign coming up?
Well, I think it was a surprise in the sense that it's very rare for a president here not to seek re-election. But having said that, over the past few months, it was clear that there are a number of obstacles in Mr. Hollande's path to re-election. He said last year that he would only run again if he could bring unemployment down. And he admitted tonight that that just hadn't happened quickly enough. At the same time, he's been facing some pretty awful approval ratings, as low as 4%, according to one recent poll. And there are also deep splits in his Socialist Party over how to manage the economy, for example. The real question now is whether any other socialist candidate would have an easier run at the presidency with the party so unpopular and the left so divided.
Lucy, once again, thanks for the update there in Paris. Lucy Williamson. The United Kingdom is one of the biggest markets for chocolate anywhere in the world, and in the wake of the Brexit vote, some countries, unhappy with the EU's current trade deals, are talking about forging better links with Britain. The British are in fact the fourth largest consumers of chocolate in the world. 95% of that chocolate is imported from the EU. Most of the cocoa beans come from the African state of Ivory Coast, which produces very little of the chocolate itself. So could Ivory Coast negotiate its own separate deal with the UK? The BBC's Didi Akinlure has been to Ivory Coast to find out more for us.
This doesn't look like chocolate, but it is. Cocoa pods are fruits of the tropical forest. They produce the essential ingredient for a global industry. If you've ever eaten a bar of chocolate, the chances are the cocoa in it came from here in Ivory Coast. The West African nation is the world's largest producer. After fermenting and drying, the beans are taken to the exporters in town. From here they are shipped into Europe before finally arriving in the UK. Ivory Coast is a key hub for exports in West Africa, and trade is vital. Post-Brexit, the country hopes to improve on its direct trade relationship with the United Kingdom.
I think the UK being out of the European Union, we have an opportunity, both of us, African countries and the UK, to negotiate new trade agreements. And that's an opportunity that we have to seize.
At the moment, these beans end up being traded on the financial markets where cocoa prices are mainly set in pound sterling. After the Brexit vote, the price of cocoa fell along with the pound, causing concern for exporters. They would prefer to trade in other currencies like the euro.
We're not interested in selling cocoa to the UK because it would be in pound sterling. But if by some miracle the pound goes back to what it was, then yes, why not sell them cocoa? But for now it's not an option.
Trade experts in the economic capital, Abidjan, are less apprehensive about the pound and insist that Brexit creates opportunities.
When we look at the consumer of chocolate, UK is the fourth largest consumer in the world, so it would be silly for Côte d'Ivoire not to enter into direct trade agreement with the UK. So Brexit will give us that opportunity to renegotiate trade agreement with the UK.
Most of the cocoa that comes out of Ivory Coast is exported as raw beans. Chocolate is expensive to produce, and without government support, local companies cannot compete with global producers.
To encourage the export of finished cocoa products and not just the raw beans, the Ivorian government has provided tax incentives, and this has led to a fresh crop of entrepreneurs.
And now here is your piece de resistance. Olga Yenu is an entrepreneur in the capital-intensive cocoa business. 4 years after launching her business, she has still not made any profit. She's keen to export her products to the UK and hopes to benefit from free trade.
I like to sell my product to United Kingdom because I am able to offer attractive price, because now government allow us to export cocoa product free taxes.
Brexit will change Britain's relationship with the whole world. The future of trade between Africa and the UK is still uncertain, and trade negotiations can last for years, but there could be opportunities for the land of chocolate. Didi Akinlure, BBC News, Ivory Coast.
The search is over for a teacher to serve a remote community in the Inner Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland. The Isle of Muck has a population of around 40 people, and now the children have a teacher from Hampshire who liked the look of island life and applied successfully for the job after seeing an appeal for applicants. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon went to meet her.
Saying goodbye to the mainland with its comforts and conveniences for a new life across the sea. Muck's new teacher moved from Hampshire to the Hebrides to take up her post.
Think about somewhere on the island you'd really like to take me to.
The beach.
It's a big change. The class is small, just like the island. That was part of the attraction.
I was really inspired by the idea of something completely different, about having an adventure that the whole family could enjoy and just doing something brave.
You enjoying it so far?
I love it. I really love living here.
The whole island here is a school. The classroom is not just inside, it's also outdoors. What's it like having a new teacher?
It's a relief. She really helps us do our work. She's very good at drawing. Yeah, she's the best drawing teacher. She's a really good teacher we've ever seen, ever.
The parents' plea to find a teacher for their children attracted interest from around the world. People wanting to move to this remote rural location.
Of course, it's not always like this. The weather here can at times be pretty bad, and the island can sometimes be cut off. But the newest additions to this small community have come very well prepared.
We bought a chest freezer back down south and packed it full of food, and Laura's bought plenty of tea as well. So yeah.
How much tea?
26 boxes, was it?
Something like that. Yeah. Quite a lot of tea. Bye guys, have a nice afternoon.
The Mariners hope to stay here for many years to come. Happy they've swapped the 9 to 5 for island life in this isolated corner of Scotland. Lorna Gordon, BBC News on the Isle of Muck.
And that's it from us now on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.